Please note that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded, and we'll also be saving the chat after the meeting. Good morning, my name is Rob Willis, and I use the pronouns he, him. I'm today's moderator facilitator, and along with my colleague Janelle Roberts, we're the contractor supporting this roundtable. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if there's anything we can do to support your participation. So I'd like to immediately turn it over to Navas Bermudez, EPA's Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Office of Water, to convene the meeting. Navas, please.
Thanks, Rob. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today for this important regional roundtable on implementation of waters of the United States. As Rob said, my name is Navas Bermudez, and I'm Deputy Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Water. As some of y'all may be aware, this year we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. This milestone offers us an opportunity to take stock of the incredible progress we have made over the last 50 years. It's also a great time to assess ways to sustain that progress. While rivers in this country no longer catch fire, new challenges continue to emerge, and there are some old challenges that have persisted through the years. Waters of the United States remains a critical issue. The definition of waters of the United States is fundamental to the Clean Water Act and central to continuing to ensure clean and safe water that we all rely on. Given the importance and the high level of interest in this topic, EPA and the Army have committed to conducting extensive outreach with stakeholders and our co-regulators. The fact is, our country's water resources are incredibly diverse, as are the experiences and perspectives of those who are affected by the application of this term on the ground. So it's important that the agencies understand those experiences and perspectives. Today's roundtable and the other 9 that will be happening over the next several weeks are one part of this effort. Rather than talking at you, our goal for today is to hear from you. That's why we've asked you to choose the discussion topics y'all wanted to focus on for today's roundtable. We will be doing the same for all the roundtables because we have already seen that different regions have very different concerns, and we want to get a better sense of the difference between the regions and their concerns. One thing I should note here is that last fall, we proposed a rule about the definition of waters of the United States. The public comment period on that proposal closed on February 7th, and we are reviewing the comments that we received. Although we can't consider any new information provided here today as part of that process, we look forward to hearing your feedback and experiences with how we have implemented that term so that we can do a better job of making sure we all have access to clean water going forward. I want to thank all of you, especially the National Parks Conservation Association folks, for not only taking the time to develop a well thought out and diverse nomination, but for helping develop today's agenda and also for being here. I know it was not easy to coordinate so many schedules for today. I have no doubt that this will be an incredibly valuable conversation. So for the sake of time, I will now turn it over to Jamie Pinkham, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army Civil Works, to say a few words. Take it away, Jamie.
Great. Thank you, Navas, and thanks everyone for joining us today, and also thanks NPCA for helping organize today's event. I am Jamie Pinkham, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, and along with Assistant Secretary Mike Connor, we provide oversight and policy direction for the Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works program. And I'd also like to note that Stacy Jensen and Elliot Carmen with Army Civil Works team is also joining me this morning. Army recognizes the importance and value of our nation's water resources, and that's why we've been pleased to join with EPA in this effort to hear from you and understand your experiences and perspectives related to waters of the U.S. And we're particularly interested in gaining a better understanding of ways to ensure implementation of waters of the U.S. is clear and with the appropriate level of coordination or consideration for regional differences. And in addition, we're interested in understanding any tools that may exist that may help with better implementing the definition. The Army Corps of Engineers is one of the primary agents of Clean Water Act implementation as they engage with the other co-regulators of tribes and states and local governments, as well as landowners and stakeholders who we engage with on a daily basis. And as a result, we know firsthand how important open communication and understanding is to implementing the Clean Water Act. And we look forward to hearing your input on the topics you have chosen for today's roundtable. Thank you again for joining us.
Great. Thank you both very, very much. So by now, whether you like it or not, you're probably a semi-seasoned veteran of Zoom or other web conferencing. But despite that, I am going to spend the next 3 minutes or less maybe briefly orienting you to how I plan to use Zoom during the meeting, and then we're just going to jump right into the meeting. So I first want to recognize that virtual meetings, they present an indescribable number of ways to go sideways. So if you start talking while you're on mute or you're unmuted and something happens, there are dogs barking in the background, a bad internet connection, interruptions from children, no big deal. We've all experienced that. It's totally okay. But that being said, to minimize disruptions, please keep yourself on mute unless speaking. You can access all of the Zoom meeting controls via the meeting panel as displayed up there on the screen. The meeting panel sometimes disappears, and if you want to find it, all you have to do is move your mouse over the Zoom screen and it should reappear. You can mute and unmute yourself by pressing that old-time looking microphone that's there labeled number 1 on the screen. If you press that, that puts a red line through it. That signals that you are muted on the Zoom. Please feel free to turn on your video during the roundtable, and most of you already have that done, so I appreciate that. If you need to shut that off to take care of something, you just press that camera icon and there'll be a red slash through it and your video will be off. The button labeled number 3 is the participants button. If you press that button, you can see who is on who is in the meeting. The 4th button there is the chat button. We plan to use chat during this roundtable. If you press that chat icon, that pulls up a separate chat box. The way I've set up Zoom is to allow roundtables participants to chat directly to one another. And also you can send chats to everybody that's in the Zoom. At the end of each of the discussion blocks that we've set up, I am going to direct folks to use the chat. So you should familiarize yourself with that feature. If you need any technical assistance or if there's anything we can do to support your participation, please send Janelle a chat or email Janelle. We're going to put her email address into the chat right now. If having captions in English is desired, you can press the live transcript button labeled number 5 on the slide there, and then you'll see another menu pop up and you click show subtitle, and that will put live English captions into the bottom of your screen. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, is I'm planning on using the raise hand feature during the discussion. So I'm going to ask you to virtually raise your hand to jump into the conversation. And here's how you do it. So there are 2 ways to raise your hand in Zoom. If you're like me and grew up on WordPerfect, I seek out keyboard shortcuts. The keyboard shortcut to raise your hand is Alt-Y. You can press Alt-Y, that raises the hand, Alt-Y lowers the hand. If you have a reactions button on your toolbar, you can press the reactions button. And then there should be an option there like you see up on the screen, just below number 6 to raise and lower your hand. Okay, one last thing I'm asking folks to do if you haven't already, and most of you have already, is to rename yourself in Zoom. So I understand who has their hand raised. Sometimes I have these Zoom meetings going on and it's, I'll get something like Rob, Max's dog dad or something on the Zoom from a previous Zoom meeting, and that makes it very difficult for me. So to change your name on Zoom, what you want to do is you click the participants tab and then the participants list will pop out. You toggle over your name and some options will appear. You can select rename, and then it'll generate a dialog box and you can rename yourself. And so I'm going to give folks just a couple of seconds to do that if your name is not intuitive. Okay, sweet. All right, so how we're going to spend our time together this morning. So we've got 3 discussion blocks. The first discussion block is a roundtable participant introduction and round robin. We have 60 minutes set aside for that. The way that's going to run is I'm going to ask folks just to go around the table and I'm going to ask every single person to participate in this section and introduce themselves and then reflect on a couple of discussion questions. And I'll pop those up on the screen when we get to it. We're then going to have a discussion block with some questions focused on climate change. And then we have a set of discussion blocks having to do with environmental justice in downstream communities. Now, Dr. Pearson, I saw that you raised your hand. I didn't know if you were just practicing or if you had a question. Either one of them, I am extremely excited that someone used their raised hand feature. So Dr. Pearson, if you had a question, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in with it.
A little bit of both. Thank you so much. I can't seem to get the chat feature to change from everyone to just specifically to Janelle. Is anyone else trying to do that? Send a message specifically to Janelle?
So first, let me make sure that I've got that set up correct. Yes, so the way you do that, if you hit the chat feature, Dr. Pearson, and then where it says to and it says to everyone, there should be a little down caret. If you press that down caret, hopefully it should generate a list, and then you can pick out Janelle in that list. And if that's not working, send her an email.
Okay.
Cool. Are there any other questions before we jump into it? Okay, so this is what we're going to do. I am going to randomly select people from the list of participants here, and I'm going to ask that you introduce yourself, and as you introduce yourself, I'm going to invite that you reflect on the questions that we have there on the screen. So it's really going to be only unfair for the first person because I didn't give them a heads up. But the way I decided is, since I felt as if I was always last with the last name Willis, I'm going to go with a person whose last name is the end, and we're going to start with that person. So I'm going to come to Kyle Wells, and then following Kyle Wells, I'm going to come to you, Dr. Pearson. So Kyle, do you mind starting?
Thank you, Rob. I have no problem starting, but just for the record, I wanted to be clear that my last name is Dreyfus Wells. So that's fine. My mother-in-law would be very happy. So I'm happy to take it for the team, but I'm a proud D. So Rob, to the first question about who am I am Kyle Dreyfus Wells. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. So we're a large regional district. We provide regional sanitary or wastewater treatment services and stormwater management services to the city of Cleveland and 61 suburban communities across 355 square miles of the Lake Erie watershed. The best way to think about us in terms of our relationship with our member communities is we take care of the big stuff, big sanitary and big streams, and our member communities take care of the small stuff. So that's the first question. Do you want me to roll to the second question? Okay,
yeah,
great.
Just jump right into the second question.
All right, so in terms of our personal experience, speaking from the perspective of the sewer district and why protecting water bodies in the Midwest is so important, I will say this, that the quality of our rivers, streams, and lakes is really a manifestation of how we manage the land and how we manage stormwater runoff from that land. So 50 years in on the Clean Water Act, I think it's all important that we all recognize that the water quality is a result of the land use, and we really need to look at that land use and how we manage runoff. So in Greater Cleveland, like a lot of communities across the Midwest, the majority of our development happened pre-1960s, prior to the advent of the floodplain regulations, the riparian setbacks, the stormwater management regulations. So we estimate that about 80% of the impervious surface in our service area developed before there were federal, state, and local regulations. I think this is a really important fact as we look at addressing water quality issues. And in our service area, based on the extensive studies that we've done at the sewer district, we know that the current drivers of water quality impairment are increased stormwater flow, the filling of headwater and ephemeral streams, and failing local sewer infrastructure. And that is, I think, very important. I'm not mentioning combined sewer overflow because we are taking care of combined sewer overflow through our $3 billion 25-year consent decree. So we have a regional stormwater management program. We have holistic watershed-based studies across our whole service area that show about $1 billion in need on the stormwater side, flooding, erosion, water quality issues. We have another extensive set of sewer system evaluation studies that show about another $1 billion in failing local infrastructure. I'm talking about SSOs, inflow and infiltration, flooded basements, bread and butter issues that bring people in contact with sewage. Big problem. So that's the brief look at Northeast Ohio. And we're doing a great job. I'll just end with that.
Great. Thank you very much. And I apologize about not getting the last name right there.
No problem.
Great. I'm going to come to Dr. Pearson next, and then after Dr. Pearson's, I'm going to come to Francis Thickey. So Dr. Pearson, please.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Dr. Marion Pearson, and I am a physician. I'm a pediatrician, and I've been in practice for 20 plus years in the Kansas City metro area. I am a native Kansas City Missourian, and right at the onset of the pandemic, I've helped to found a nonprofit. It is a small nonprofit startup called Mo Hives KC, and our work in the urban core of Kansas City, Missouri, is to convert vacant, blighted property into urban apiaries, and we involve urban residents in that process, and we educate and again involve the community in really urban conservation, specifically of the honeybee, but certainly more globally of pollinators that live in and work in the urban core as the Kansas Cityans do. We have a waterway that runs through most of the urban core of Kansas City. The Brush Creek waterway runs through not only Johnson County, but comes to Jackson County, and then eventually to the Missouri River, and then ultimately to the Mississippi River. Brush Creek water quality is important because our pollinators are located at our large urban apiary less than a mile from Brush Creek. And Brush Creek has been a waterway affected very severely and intensely by flooding, certainly sewer runoff, and whatever else ends up in that waterway ends up ultimately in the Missouri River. The health of that waterway specifically being in such close proximity to our apiary is critically important, not only for the pollinators that we are trying to care for in that area, but certainly for the people. It being one urban waterway that a lot of urban residents are exposed to, the quality of it is important because that may be the only waterway they see in a lifetime. Unfortunately, many urban residents don't move far from the Brush Creek area. So protecting that particular waterway, and certainly the others across the country, is personal for me because it is the city in which I live. It is a city in which I take care of patients, pediatric patients. And it's a city in which we now have to care for our urban pollinators in. And so really making headway in this space is important to me, making sure that we do support initiatives that would help keep those waterways clean. That's important to me as well. We partner with the Missouri Department of Conservation, the Missouri Department of Agriculture, and we even have started a green jobs program. So again, teaching young people about what it takes to conserve, to practice urban conservation is important to me. So making sure that we have some basics outlined as we teach those things is really important to me. I hope I answered all the questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Pearson. So as I mentioned before, next I'm coming to Francis Thickey, and then after Francis, I'm going to come to Kristen Schwehofer. Francis, please.
Sorry about the mute. Okay, thank you, Rob. I'm a farmer from Iowa. I'm a dairy farmer and crop farmer, and I'm also a soil scientist with a master's and PhD in soil fertility. And I see we have huge problems in Iowa with our water quality. Iowa State University research tells us that 93% of the nitrogen that comes from Iowa, to the dead zone, to the hypoxic zone, it comes from agriculture. And 79% of the phosphorus comes from agriculture in Iowa. And we have goals to reduce that. Since 2013, we've had a nutrient reduction strategy. However, we've not made any progress that can be verified on that. A lot of talk, but not much progress. The problem is that it's not very well understood that Iowa's corn and soybean acres are inherently leaky. 2/3 of Iowa's land surface is covered in corn and soybeans every year. and it's inherently leaky. It's a flawed system for water quality because corn and soybeans only have live roots in the soil for about 5 months of the year. So during most of the year, there are no live roots in the soil. So when it rains, the nitrate it's soluble. It's taken right down to the tile drains, which is present everywhere in the good soil in Iowa, right down to the tile drains and ultimately to the dead zone. So it's a flawed system, and that's not well understood. The ag groups in Iowa like to blame it on the weather. They say, well, it rains too hard or something like that. But the problem is, unless we have remedial practices, and I advocate for practices on the landscape, like cover crops, more diversity of crops that can solve the problem on the landscape. Also, you have to fix it on the end of the field, edge of field, and I call those conservation diapers. Whether it's some kind of a bioreactor or some kind of a buffer strip or something like that, we have to catch what we have not utilized in the field. I could go on, but maybe I've used my time.
Thank you, Francis, very much. Next, I'm going to come to Kristen Schwehofer and then Heather Navarro. Kristen, please. And I hope I pronounced your name okay.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Kristen Schwehofer, and I'm the Environmental Health Director for the Washtenaw County Health Department located in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I worked in public and environmental health for over 22 years. My work at a local health department involves inspection of restaurants, childcare centers, and swimming pools. It involves permitting the installation of new or replacement individual drinking water wells for homes and for non-community water supplies, such as at small businesses, daycare centers, schools, and the like. It involves permitting the installation of new and replacement on-site sewage disposal systems for homes that are not serviced by sanitary sewer, and it involves the inspection and regulation of businesses that house and store chemicals, among many, many other things. One of the central focuses of our work is involved in investigating and addressing conditions, illnesses, and diseases that impact or may impact public health related to the environment. Some examples of that are surveillance for mosquitoes and ticks that carry illnesses such as Zika virus and Lyme disease, performing bathing beach water quality monitoring, investigating complaints of mold, investigating rodent and nuisance complaints, involvement in vapor intrusion investigations, response to harmful algal blooms, and response to groundwater contamination. Given the nature of this conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the 1,4-dioxane contamination under portions of the city of Ann Arbor. 1,4-dioxane is a likely human carcinogen, and this plume of groundwater contamination, originating from a local business decades ago, has been the subject of lawsuits, from court-ordered cleanups, and continues to impact both ground and surface water in our communities. The plume is estimated at 3 square miles in size and has over 250 monitoring wells to help us understand the size, location, and level of contamination. And that's still not enough. Over the course of time, many homes have been connected to municipal water because their drinking water wells have become contaminated. Thousands more homes have been restricted from groundwater use as a result of this contamination. Every day, thousands of gallons of water are pumped and treated to reduce the levels of 1,4-dioxane, as they have for decades. The treated groundwater is then returned under permit to a tributary of surface water. This treated groundwater still has 1,4-dioxane in it, along with bromate, which is a likely human carcinogen and a byproduct of the treatment process. Tributary ultimately discharges upstream to our city of Ann Arbor's surface water intake as their main water supply for the residents' drinking water. Meanwhile, under the city, the groundwater is generally flowing toward the Huron River, local river, and as the depth of groundwater fluctuates beneath the city, we are seeing 1,4-dioxane close enough to the surface to be found in local storm drains. This brings up much discussion and debate about groundwater surface water interface and how to address this contaminate and under what regulatory framework. Meanwhile, there are homes whose basement foundations may have direct contact with groundwater. And as the contamination plume moves east, entry of contaminated water into homes is being investigated. There is no end in sight to this particular contamination. And then additionally, in Michigan, over the last few years, we have been very aggressive in taking a massive drinking water testing effort for PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, easy to say. PFAS is linked to reproductive and developmental effects, as well as chronic health conditions. Because PFAS does not readily degrade in the environment, even permitted discharges to surface water accumulate and have additive downstream effects. The Huron River winds through many communities in Michigan, and its main source, as I mentioned, is the main source of drinking water for the city of Ann Arbor. These permitted discharges upstream mean the city of Ann Arbor has invested significant resources to monitor and remove PFAS from its drinking water supply. The Huron River is also very popular for recreation and fishing. There's unfortunately an ongoing do not eat fish advisory for members of our community, and advisory for those who recreate on the Huron River to avoid foam, which may contain PFAS levels high enough to cause illness in children and pets. So for these reasons and many others, I just want to emphasize that in my experience, all the water is connected, and public health is about preventing illness, disease, and injury. And so I feel strongly we should try to do the same for our waters. If we're not preventing and aggressively addressing these threats and risks, we, as well as our future generations, will be left with the consequences. Thanks for providing this opportunity and considering this vital topic.
Great, Kristen, thank you. Next, I'm going to come to Heather, and then from Heather, I'm going to come to Irma. And please don't hesitate to use the chat to augment your fellow roundtable participants' perspectives. So feel free to drop things in the chat if something strikes you during it. I do want to encourage as much participation as possible, and only one person can be talking at the time, but all 25 of us can be using chat at the same time. So Heather, I'm going to come to you, and then Irma to you. Heather, please.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Heather Navarro, and I was an alderwoman in the city of St. Louis for about 4.5 years, and that's primarily how I come here today, but I also spent a little over 7 years as the director of a statewide environmental advocacy group in Missouri. And then as of January this year, I have been the director of the Midwest Climate Collaborative, which is a 12-state multi-sector collaborative working on climate change throughout our 12-state region. So I come at this with a local, state, and regional perspective. I'm really going to just focus on the local and state perspective right here. And so Missouri has over 180,000 miles of rivers and streams. We're a very water-rich state, and how we define those streams and rivers is very important to what our water quality looks like. And we are dependent on these as well as groundwater for drinking water, agriculture, recreation. All of this is extremely important to our health and our livelihoods. And there's a lot of ecosystem services provided by floodplains and wetlands, which are important for clean, fresh, abundant water. And I think that's one of the big things that I always come back to, both in the city of St. Louis and in our state. People often think of rivers as this single channel that they might see, coursing alongside the city. But our river systems are really much more complex: braided streams, forks, tributaries. It includes the ground over which the river moves. Maybe it's not the channel currently, but it very much feeds that channel. And so those exact boundaries often change, which is a really good thing, because that's what keeps our soil replenished with nutrients, provides natural water filtration, flood absorption, important habitat for waterfowl and fish. And so in Missouri, if we don't think about the floodplains as part of our rivers, we end up with hazardous waste, petrochemicals, radioactive waste, coal ash, and all sorts of things threatening our water supply. In addition to those floodplains and wetlands, ephemeral streams, losing streams are extremely important in Missouri. We have a lot of karst topography. So one of the interesting things that we have studied is how water moves across communities from one to the other. And so even though we might not see a surface stream carrying pollution from one community to another, we know that contamination can travel hundreds of miles underground. And so that's why it's important to think about all the ways that we are connected, from streams, rivers, lakes, wells, and ultimately to people. One of the other things I think is important in St. Louis is that we are downstream of a lot of agriculture. So whether it's atrazine, it's nutrient pollution, a variety of chemical inputs, they have to be handled when thinking about cleaning out our drinking water. And when there are heavy rains north and west of us, we are inundated by accumulated floodwaters, and how we handle that water affects who is flooded, how much, and the scope of those losses. And in the St. Louis region particularly, it often feels like every municipality for themselves in terms of development in the floodplain. Every community seems to have their own rules about who can build what where and how much public financing they're going to get. It often pits communities against one another. And each, like I said, each local government kind of has their own approach to this. And so, the communities that are up and downstream who are also affected often don't have a say in those decisions. But we are all connected by what happens, and it's important that decision making goes beyond hyper local individual interests. And I think the last thing I'll just say is one of the things similar to Kansas City, I think, is people's connection to our waterways has really been degraded over the years. In large part, we have the Mississippi River right at our front door, the Missouri River right here at the side gate here in the city of St. Louis. And people are just very disconnected, because what they know of our rivers is that they move really fast. say naturally fast. They think of them as very dirty and polluted, and they don't appreciate the value that our water resources really offer. And it's very sad because, as we'll talk about later in terms of climate change, being able to really maximize the resiliency that our rivers offer our communities is going to be really important into the future. And I should also just mention aging infrastructure as well. We've got an almost $5 billion consent decree. So sewer overflows is one of the ways that St. Louisans, when they think about connection to water, it's usually not necessarily positive, which is very unfortunate because we do have incredible water resources here in this region. And we are all absolutely dependent on them for health and just happy, productive livelihoods as well. So thank you for the time this morning.
Heather, thank you. So I'm going to go to Irma, and then following Irma, I'm going to come to Chris. Irma, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Irma Liebhardt. I am a community organizer in Detroit, Michigan, with the Michigan chapter of the Sierra Club. My work involves watershed management planning, and I am a super strong, awesome, I think, advocate for green stormwater infrastructure, yay, policies and programs. I also serve as co-state lead with the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition. It is a 170-member organization whose purpose is to advocate for programs and policies and resources to restore and protect our Great Lakes watershed. As I think probably all know, the Great Lakes are magnificent bodies of water, representing 20% of the world's fresh surface water and close to 85% of the fresh surface water in North America. So, provides drinking water for 40 million people. So we are definitely connected to our waterways and understanding truly the value of the Great Lakes ecosystem and the Great Lakes basin. However, we are not without our problems. We living in Detroit, for example, we are surrounded by two rivers that are areas of concern, the Detroit and the Rouge River. And so, we've got massive contamination due to industrialization. We're proud of our history, as the Arsenal of Defense and the city, the country on wheels, but it has come at a price. So with industrialization, human activity, and weak standards, when we have weakened standards and inadequate regulation, we are seeing the impacts of that in our air, land, and water. Devastating effects of climate change are hitting us really hard. We've got CSOs that have been mentioned, flooding, drought, our water temperatures are rising, water levels are fluctuating, and that's causing soil erosion and coastal erosion. And then, of course, toxic algal blooms, unfortunately, plaguing primarily Lake Erie, but we're now also seeing these algal blooms in Lake Superior. And then fish die-offs. And as an angler, certainly that affects many of us because we have an $11 billion fishery here. So we're seeing environmental impacts and also the potential for economic impacts. Again, I grew up fishing in Lake Erie, and I'm seeing now, I remember the pristine beaches. I mean, they were just like her picture, the cover photo, it was like that. With an abundance of variety of fish. And we're now, seeing, some species just aren't there, or in less abundance. And then there's the contamination. We also have the fish advisories. So a lot of our low income folks, fish as sustenance, this is part of their regular meals, but with fish advisories, they can only eat so much. And so there's that personal impact. But, I would say, fortunately, with the Clean Water Act regulations, we have seen improvements, the NPDES, the industrial treatment program, these things are making a difference. But with our legacy and sediment, very expensive to get it out. And also, unfortunately, we're now seeing threats from emerging contaminants. someone mentioned PFAS, and then there's microplastics and pharmaceuticals and endocrine disruptors and, things that are appearing that, we're just continuing. We clean up, but then we're continuing to, allow other contaminants. So, it's critical that we look at all bodies of water, streams, ephemeral streams, intermittent, that are wetlands, because they are critical to from occurring. And I would like to say, I know the WOTUS, there's references to commercial, the navigable waters and commerce. From an economic perspective, we have $3.1 trillion domestic product economy around the Great Lakes. So it is strongly environmentally focused, but also there is economy within that, environmental perspective. We need to protect these water sources, and also take into consideration biodiversity, as well as like this, our drinking water.
Great. Irma, thank you so much. Next, I'm coming to Chris, and then from Chris, I'm coming to Emmett. So Chris, jump in.
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Spalding, co-owner, president of Brewery Vivant in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're a small brewery. We specialize in European-style beer and food, and sustainability is part of our business plan and our everyday. We're a certified B Corp and also the first LEED certified microbrewery in the world on a commercial basis. So exciting stuff. So my business and others within the food and beverage industry are 100% dependent on having access to clean water. Water, of course, is the main ingredient in beer, but also essential when we grow. If you think of all the products that go into beer, barley and hops specifically, and then, of course, all of the food that we serve on our menu through our kitchen. My husband and I run this business together, created it with a focus on having a positive impact on our community and the environment, with the idea that the business won't thrive without the support of our community, but it also won't thrive without having a clean and healthy environment to participate in and get the high quality ingredients that we need to make the beer and the food that we serve. Our water source in Grand Rapids is Lake Michigan. Such a large body of water that I think there's a mindset it'll be forever consistently supplying us with clean water, but we all know that's not necessarily true. The health of that is definitely in jeopardy with pollution, invasive species, climate change. All of these different impacts are continuing to, I think, cause concern to me and many others in our industry. So everything we can do to protect Lake Michigan, but also all of the surrounding watersheds and all the water bodies within our area is really imperative today, and more importantly for future generations. I have kids, and I just think about what is this world that they're going to inherit from us, and oh my gosh, that'll keep you up at night. So one of our goals is to have 75% of our expenses to be from within the state of Michigan. So that's everything from our healthcare to, who we use for marketing materials, as well as things like hops and the beef that becomes our burgers. With that local focus, we know that the many bodies of water in our state need that protection, so our supply chain won't be disrupted, despite the fact that, we get our water from the lake. So we need these protections for clean water with that long-term focus as far as regulations to ensure that we all continue to have access to it. There's a really strong movement within our industry, the brewing industry specifically, to protect water resources. The Brewers for Clean Water within the Natural Resources Defense Council is a very important and dominant voice in this space, with a lot of breweries participating. A lot of our suppliers and other companies in the industry do use municipal water supply that comes from groundwater or other smaller water bodies. And because of that, their water supply could be threatened more easily than mine. If you think of streams and wetlands feeding public drinking water supplies, they are more vulnerable to pollution, as we're all talking about, and environmental harm. So for that reason, I think it's very important that the EPA adopt a strong WOTUS rule durable in the face of partisan shifts, hard to think of that, and that adequately protect our source waters. Beyond the obvious benefits of a clean environment for public health, protecting source water is also great for the economy, as it ensures that we have a viable financial future for businesses and industries relying on the water. The tourism industry in the Great Lakes states is crucial for businesses like mine and many others. So protecting our water is really important to us and to tourism as well. So thanks for this opportunity.
Chris, thank you. Next, I'm going to have Emmett, and then from Emmett, I'm going to go to Dr. Sullivan. Emmett, please jump in.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Emmett Pearson Jr., and I'm the president and CEO of Community Builders of Kansas City here in Kansas City. We are a 501c3 not-for-profit community development corporation and have been around for 30 plus years. We do most of our work on the east side of Kansas City, which is an under-resourced, underserved, primarily African-American population. Over our 30-year history, we have done in excess of $300 million of development, running from single-family housing to commercial development, to retail development, to the development of a FQHC, Swope Health Services here. So the only things we haven't done is a hotel and industrial park, and an industrial park is on the horizon. Dr. Pearson kind of alluded to the Brush Creek, which it's directly across from the centerpiece of our base of operation. I look at it every day. I look out my window and see it. And she was very eloquent in laying out the concerns around pollination, the drinking water quality of it. I would come at it a little bit different, or I should say, I would add to that to say that when we typically think of water quality, we think of in those terms. I look at it a little bit differently from the standpoint of when I look out my window, I see where two watersheds, Town Fork Creek and Blue River, come together and they flow into and dump into Brush Creek. Brush Creek, for reference, here in Kansas City, runs from our most wealthiest part of town, the Country Club Plaza. So if you're familiar with Kansas City, it's a high-end shopping area. And it runs all the way through the base of operation, which again is at the heart of one of the worst underserved, under-resourced communities in Kansas City, as well as in Missouri. And so from that, the water quality from an aesthetic standpoint looks terrible. It is a collection point for pollution. It routinely has significant amounts of E. coli bacteria. It is basically the collection point of Kansas City and surrounding communities, trash. When we worked with the Corps of Engineers, with the help of then Senator Kit Bond, we really worked on how Brush Creek would flow, and for lack of maintenance, right across the street from me, it's called the Lake of the Enshriners. It used to be about 18 feet deep. Now it's 2 feet deep. So you can imagine what that does to much of the wildlife. We have a couple of eagles that still come there, but pretty much the wildlife is gone, and it is in much need. So, and that's at the heart of what we do. We also own true grocery stores in food deserts. So even with the two grocery stores, we're still in a food desert. And so we are trying to launch, an endeavor homegrown. So we are extremely concerned about not only water, but also the soil. As a developer, sometimes developers get a bad rap. We are a community developer. Everything we do has community in and of what we do. It is the foremost of what we do. We don't take on any project without getting significant community involvement. And everything we do is to provide for unmet needs for goods and services in urban Kansas City. So with that, I will be quiet and turn it back over.
Emmett, thank you very much. I have Dr. Sullivan, then I'm coming to Hope. Dr. Sullivan.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Majeka Patricio Sullivan. I am professor and associate director at the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State University. in Columbus, Ohio. I'm also the director of the Schiermeyer Olentangy River Wetland Research Park, which is a Ramsar, so a wetland of international importance, where we do research and outreach and education on wetlands and watersheds. My advanced degrees are in natural resources and biology, so I'm here today to share a perspective of science, which both involves my work on the conservation and ecology of watersheds in coastal areas, as well as my experience in informing policy. I'm based in the Midwest right now, of course, at Ohio, but I have significant geographical perspectives from my work. We work in the Midwest broadly, so in many areas of Indiana and Kentucky and other areas, but also have projects that we work on in the Northeast, the Intermountain West, the Southeast, and Puerto Rico. So this work, in terms of the science, for me has led to a role in WOTUS and WOTUS discussions over about a decade now, starting in 2014-15 when I served on the EPA Science Advisory Board panel reviewing the connectivity report, which was a massive tome of scientific evidence outlining watershed connectivity. And subsequently, I have offered briefings to Congress on a few occasions, multiple suites, seminars and webinars, and written extensively on the role of science in water protection. I'll put one up I think might be useful for the group if I can do that a little bit later. I also have supporting degrees in anthropology and Native American studies, which I think is relevant to this conversation because I do work quite a bit with tribal colleagues and partners around water rights and ecosystem integrity on tribal lands, which I think is an important part of this conversation. So I want to share just a few brief points in my introduction today relative to the second question, but they really revolve around the fact that the science is quite unequivocal. We know that upstream waters such as headwater streams and wetlands affect downstream systems through a suite of chemical, physical, and biological connections. And these connections can vary in magnitude and intensity. And the role of science is very important in being able to be appropriately used to calibrate and inform policy on this issue. So I want to mention three messages that I'd like to get across from my perspective as a scientist. The first one is I think that this conversation is really mostly about, in terms of when we get into the heart of it, it's about vulnerable waters. And vulnerable waters are those that are headwater streams, ephemeral streams, as most of you know, that those are flowing after precipitation events, intermittent streams, those that flow seasonally, and geographically isolated wetlands, so those that are found outside of floodplains. Those are the ones that we consider vulnerable waters for a suite of reasons, but also tend to to lose protection first. The connectivity between these vulnerable waters and iconic systems, such as the Great Lakes, which have been mentioned quite a bit, the Ohio River, the Missouri, and the upper Mississippi in the Midwest are critical. And the connectivity can be mediated by, it's not just about water quality as we tend to think about it in terms of the chemical or pollutants in water, but it's also the biological and physical factors. For example, the upstream to downstream movement of sediment in rivers is a really very, very important type of physical connectivity. Wetlands is another type of vulnerable waters, can act as chemical sinks, right? We know they clean water, sort of act as nature's kidneys. And in doing so, they protect downstream waters by retaining compounds through a whole suite of physical and chemical processes, such as denitrification and sedimentation and long-term storage in plant material, and many others. Animals are a big part of this picture. So migratory animals transport nutrients and energy and other organisms between disparate locations, and they provide a functional connectivity among wetlands and other water bodies. And of course, we talked about fish being very important in terms of their role in the ecosystem, but also in terms of their economic importance. So one point I want to get across here is that, when we start to change these smaller systems, eventually when enough changes have occurred through dredging or filling or other types of change in these vulnerable systems, we can start to expect that there are going to be threshold responses that will affect water quality and other ecosystem services, such as attenuation of flooding downstream. And as a result, just as if we were to ignore the critical role played by many tiny capillaries in our own vascular systems, If we ignore that, that can spell disaster for the human body. It's very similar when we think of watersheds. And somebody before talked about, it's not just about the main rivers, but about the entire watershed. Destroying or impairing these vulnerable waters can have and does have negative impacts on watersheds, water quality, water supply, and of course, organisms like fish and biodiversity. A lot of these vulnerable systems and wetlands are also culturally important for in many avenues in the US. We talked about fishing, for example, but we also, I think that many of them have particularly high significance for many Native peoples. That's the first point I think is about vulnerable waters. The second is that's not time to remove protection. Certainly from a scientific standpoint, we can look at that. The Midwest represents a highly altered landscape. We have, if you look across the board, wetland loss over time is massive. We've lost 90% of wetlands in Ohio, 89% in Iowa, 85% in Illinois, 87% in Indiana and Missouri, 50% in Michigan and Wisconsin. We've talked about this. The Midwest and other regions are reeling from harmful algal blooms, pollution of historic and emerging contaminants, public health issues such as the Flint water crisis, droughts, floods, and of course we have climate change. So it's really not the time to decrease watershed resiliency, it's the time to increase it. And a point that I think is very important is that although we do have areas like the Southwest, which are going to be very high in their percentage of, for example, ephemeral streams, so those that flow only after precipitation events. I want to point out that there are over 7.7 kilometers or 4.8 million miles, a little over 50% of stream channels by length in the US are ephemeral. We did some mapping here in Ohio and actually saw that 34% of our streams by length were ephemeral. 73% of channels on the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin are ephemeral. So this issue is very relevant nationally, but certainly ephemeral streams as a type of vulnerable water is very, very important in the Midwest as well. I just want to close my little piece here by saying what can science do? Certainly the best available evidence, which includes Western science, as well as indigenous knowledge and other ways of knowing need to underpin the rulemaking. The rule needs to embrace the complexity of watershed functions. Just as human bodies are complex, watersheds are also complex. The rule needs to recognize individual to cumulative effects. What I mean by that is changes not only to individual streams and wetlands, but what happens when we look at those changes over multiple streams and wetlands. And we need to think about the importance of groundwater connectivity. Furthermore, the full suite of water quality dimensions needs to be reflected. And what do I mean by that? The Clean Water Act, its objective is to protect the chemical, physical, and biological integrity. It's not an or, it's an and. And so certainly we saw in the previous rule, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, that it rested on a limited conception of just one component of physical hydrological connectivity, and for the most part ignored the chemical and biological connectivity of waters. And that, from a scientific standpoint, is untenable. And then lastly, to the extent possible, the rule needs to be adaptive to changing landscapes and a changing climate. So those are some of my points, and I look forward to talking more about the climate and other issues a little bit later. Thank you.
Elvin, thank you. Great. I'm going to go to Hope, and then following Hope, I'm coming to Kelly. So Hope, please feel free to unmute yourself and jump in.
Hi, my name is Hope Taft. I had the honor of being First Lady of Ohio from 1999 to 2007. We moved from Columbus to Greene County, Ohio, and brought a house on the Little Miami River. And that has started my deep learning curve into the importance of water. And much to our chagrin, we lost in the state legislature an effort to protect ephemeral streams. There are now ephemeral street features, which have basically no protection against construction or dumping. So that is one of my concerns is how do we protect these vulnerable water areas that we just heard about. Another thing that's one of my concerns is like many states, particularly those that border the Great Lakes, there is a Great Lakes Compact that will not allow water to be removed from those watersheds unless everybody agrees. But when you get farther down into Ohio and the waters that go into the Ohio River basin, there is no such protection, so that our aquifers could be drained off and sent to who knows where by a private landowner without much say as far as the rest of the communities in the states are concerned. Through the Little Miami Watershed Network, which I helped to start, we are doing a lot to try to connect people to the rivers, because we feel that if you don't know something, you don't love it, and if you don't love it, you won't protect it. So we're trying our best to get people to understand the value of the Little Miami River that flows through Southwest Ohio, and give them ideas of how they can protect and conserve it. And that's a quick summary, which might be nice after everyone's very long and very detailed introductions, which I've appreciated.
Great. Hope, thank you so much. I've got Kelly, and then I'm going to come to Larry. Kelly?
Thanks. So I'm Kelly Hunter Foster. I'm an environmental attorney, and I've been practicing law and working with the definition of waters of the United States since 1996. First, for 14 years as an assistant attorney general, and currently as senior attorney for Waterkeeper Alliance. And Waterkeeper Alliance is an international nonprofit group with roughly 350 Waterkeeper member groups that work across the world on 6 continents to protect and restore water quality. In the United States, the Clean Water Act, including the definition of waters of the United States, is the bedrock of the work that waterkeepers do. And we have about 165 waterkeeper groups that are working to protect and restore the nation's waters. So I have those perspectives that I've gained from working on behalf of the government and in the context of a nonprofit group in diverse watersheds across the country. But for this panel, because it's focused on the Midwest, I'm going to bring a more personal perspective to it. I was born and raised in Southwest Missouri, and I recently returned home. I grew up exploring this incredibly unique environment in the Ozarks, where we have these crystal clear streams that flow and disappear underground, only to reappear downstream again in a large spring or in the bed of the stream itself. We have these bright blue springs that emerge out of the ground or a rock face and flow to form streams, then bigger rivers like the Merrimack, the Current, the White River, and the Spring River, which then feed into larger rivers like the Missouri, the Arkansas, and the Mississippi. The Ozarks have a karst geology, and it's riddled with caves, many of which contain flowing streams and really unique species like cavefish. But we also have these massive reservoirs that draw people from across the state and across the country for recreation and fishing. So it was this, really beautiful environment, but I also grew up surrounded by abandoned lead mines that cover parts of 3 states with Superfund sites and toxic waste. Surface and underground rivers flow through them, and they move heavy metals and acid mine discharge through and into the environmental justice communities that are downstream. Wetlands, some of which are filled with mining slag, dot the landscape. So these experiences motivated me to study environmental science and become an environmental lawyer, working to protect the public and the public interest. And they helped me understand why it's so important that the Clean Water Act applies broadly to protect all of the nation's waters. It's been really obvious to me since I was young that all of these waters that I was describing are interconnected. Each of them is important for their own uses, for the people that live next to them, as well as the people that live downstream. As I got older, growing up in this environment, I learned that water pollution impoverishes communities, and also that sources of pollution end up being concentrated in areas that lack political power and wealth. But growing up here in this abandoned mining community, where waters are severely polluted or destroyed, really gives you a strong sense of the severe price that failing to protect waters have on future generations. So since returning home, I see new degradation that has come from not protecting all of the nation's waters and these unique waterways that we have here in the Ozarks. We have nutrient pollution in our interconnected surface waters and groundwaters, high levels of pathogen pollution in rivers, streams and lakes, sediment, municipal and industrial pollution. And, most heartbreakingly, a lot of the rivers that I grew up wading and exploring when I was young are now visibly polluted and no longer safe for my own son to swim in. Lastly, I just wanted to say that it's been very clear since 1972 that the Clean Water Act has mandated that we protect the integrity, physical, chemical, and biological of all of the nation's waters, and that the whole goal of the Clean Water Act is to control pollution at its source. We can't do that if we exclude large numbers of different kinds of waterways that lack these narrow connections to traditional navigable waters, interstate waters, and territorial seas. Doing that narrows the Clean Water Act in a way that's not consistent with the law. That's it for me. Thank you.
Great. Kelly, thank you. I've got Larry and then Willie. Larry, please.
Great. Thank you, Rob, and good morning, everybody. I'm Larry Weber, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Iowa, and I had the distinct pleasure of serving as the director of the nation's oldest hydraulics, hydrology, and fluid mechanics research program here at the university called IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering, for 13 years. And during that 13-year service, we had a devastating flood in 2008 that led the Iowa legislature to creating the Iowa Flood Center as the nation's only research center focused on flood science. In a similar way, in 2013, the Iowa legislature also supported the formation of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, which I co-founded with faculty at Iowa State University. So my interest is in everything that ranges from water quantity to water quality, from surface water to groundwater to atmospheric water. So very focused on water resources. Through that leadership in the state of Iowa, I also led Iowa's National Disaster Resilience Competition grant that was funded at $96.9 million. About 40 million of it has gone into building green infrastructure on private lands to hold water back during intense rainfall and process nutrients and water contaminants year round. And about $40 million has gone into an urban infrastructure stormwater management program. And as I find myself speaking to people all across the state of Iowa, I often introduce myself as not having an urban agenda and not having a rural agenda, but I do have a science agenda. And oftentimes that science agenda leads us to very complex and difficult discussions. We see flooding increasing in intensity and frequency all across the agricultural Midwest. At the same time, we see a water quality crisis that feels like a very slow-moving train, one that's unstoppable, and yet not getting the level of attention that it deserves. To give you a few examples of the water quality crisis that we're facing across the Midwest, we have deployed the nation's largest real-time continuous water quality monitoring network with real-time nitrate sensors across the state of Iowa. And what we're seeing in our data over the period of time that we are trying to reduce the nutrient load to the Gulf of Mexico, the nitrate load leaving the state of Iowa has now doubled. So we're trying to reduce it by 45%, and yet during that period, it has now increased by 100%. And I would suspect that by 2035, the goal period for the 45% reduction, we have a high likelihood of doubling the load leaving Iowa yet again. That is because of the industrialization and the intensification of agriculture across the agricultural Midwest, including the expansion of agricultural livestock production, as well as the over-application of manure from that livestock production and the coupling of commercial fertilizer application. In our state, we are currently farming about 25 to 26 million row crop acres, for which we over-apply nitrogen fertilizer and manure-based nitrogen by 100 pounds per acre. That's roughly 2.5 billion pounds. In 2 of the last 4 years, we've seen the export of nitrogen in our rivers, lakes, and streams exceed 1 billion pounds. So the math really on the back of the envelope is fairly simple to do. Well, why is that? As we work in our Iowa Watershed Approach project to deploy water holding green infrastructure throughout Iowa. In one watershed that we're working in, we're building $8.5 million worth of wetlands. And we're so proud of all the wetlands and for the water holding and water quality improvement that they have. But in that exact same watershed, over the same period of time, farmers have installed 8,400 miles of subsurface tile drainage. And I say that because with those wetlands that we've built, the impact of the tile drainage far exceeds the benefit of the screen infrastructure that we're installing. And I would argue that we lose ground to the intensification of agriculture each and every day. We have an unregulated industry in agriculture that needs policy and regulations to bring it in line with other societal needs. For our state, and I would argue the entire agricultural Midwest, we need balance between our agricultural, economic, water, natural, and human resources. And with that, I'll hold any additional comments to other elements of the day. Thank you.
Larry, thank you. Willie, I'm going to come to you. And then after that, we're going to jump into our first discussion block on climate change. So Willie, please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. My name is Willie Tully. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm from an organization called Wilderness Inquiry, based in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. You can see the Mississippi behind me on a bright sunny day, which has been hard to come by the last few months. But our organization, Wilderness Inquiry, we work a lot on outdoor recreation and education for youth and families and adults. We do a lot of work in the Twin Cities and across Minnesota, as well as nationally. And so a lot of what we do is water-based. We started in the Twin Cities and really focused on breaking down barriers to outdoor access for people who experience those barriers. That started with working specifically with people with disabilities around outdoor access, and then has grown in the last number of years to be about, how do we connect BIPOC youth and families? How do we connect individuals and families who experience financial inequity to outdoor opportunities? So this year, we're going to connect more than 20,000 people to the outdoors, coast to coast. We visit a lot of the communities reflected here today. We're in St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit and Flint, as well as New York and DC and San Francisco. And then a lot of our work happens here in the upper Midwest, in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so I think, our work, while we do talk a lot about science and the implication of climate change and water protection in our work with youth and connect that to science standards in school for school learning, a lot of how we think about water is as part of our historical and cultural and social and economic, it's the fabric of our life in the Midwest. And we think about water quality, as it impacts the ability of the communities we serve to connect these core pieces of the outdoor growing heritage in Minnesota and in the upper Midwest, and really helping people reap the benefits of engagement with nature around health outcomes, around economic outcomes. Nature in the Midwest really does revolve around water with our lakes and rivers and streams and waterways. So when we're working with kids, we often ask, or they often ask, where does our water come from? And, we paddle in the boundary waters, we paddle on the Mississippi. But I think, that question partly stems from, we've got the headquarters of the Mississippi here in our backyard. But it's more than that. It extends to the bodies of water that feed the rivers and lakes where the kids are paddling, and they see the direct impacts of upstream factors that affect water quality upstream. So for us, a lot of our work is about thinking about how to both engage the current generation, but protect water for the next generation. And part of that, we think, is having a strong role in protecting the waters of the United States. But also, as Hope touched on, really, how are we inspiring young people to become the users and lovers and stewards and protectors of the waterways that are right in their backyards and that are close to home and that provide both opportunities for recreation and learning, but also clean water to drink. And so we're excited to be part of the conversation here today. So thank you.
Great, Willie, thank you. And thank you all so much for adhering to our rough 4-minute time limit. We're right on time, and I can't tell you how happy that makes me. So we're going to pivot now, and we're going to move to our first discussion block. Our first discussion block, we're going to talk about climate change and the relationship of climate change to the WOTUS implementation. And so there are some discussion questions that are up there on the screen. And I'm not asking you to answer all of those questions, but those are just suggestions for questions you might consider reflecting on during this discussion period. So what I'm asking is the following. I'm asking that comments for this section that you keep them to under 2 minutes, so that way we have time in this 35 minutes for about 15 or so different comments. I'm asking you to please feel free to make use of the chat throughout the conversation. And then at the last minute of the conversation, I'm just going to pause and give everybody the opportunity at the end of the 35-minute block. If there's anything that they wanted to say that they didn't get an opportunity to articulate out loud, to be able to put it into the chat. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand by pressing Alt-Y to raise your hand, or you can raise your hand by pressing the reactions button and the raise hand feature. So just in case that somebody wasn't planning to raise their hand, and Larry, I see you, but I had asked chat to identify one person that I could start with. So Heather, I'm going to start with you since you're ready, and then Heather, after you, I'm going to go to you, Larry, and then you, Francis. So Heather, please jump in.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I won't take up too much time here, but as I mentioned earlier, I am the director of the Midwest Climate Collaborative. And so this is something that, that I obviously work on quite a bit. And as we've talked about, just the vastness of the water resources in the Midwest are extremely important. And on top of that, considering that our 12-state region is the 5th largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. If we were a country, we would be the 5th largest emitter. And we are responsible for 1/4 of the emissions here in the United States. So we have a tremendous responsibility when it comes to stabilizing global temperatures, and how we do that will have impacts on our water quality, because many types of energy production require water, in various different phases. And in terms of the threats to the Midwest, the greatest threats, as you all know, that we are facing are around heat and flooding, which is interspersed with periods of drought. So water is going to be extremely important. And we need to consider how rates of pollution change as water volumes change. And the EPA should definitely be considering, I would say, all of the things that are stored in our floodplains and how we keep them from contaminating our waterways. So whether that's coal ash, radioactive waste, lagoons, waste lagoons, and all sorts of things that are now going to be at greater risk because of increased precipitation and flooding. And because we know there will be times of drought, EPA should also consider how the risk to communities will fluctuate greatly year to year when the concentrations of pollutants change. In places like St. Louis that suffer from the urban heat island effect, we will see more algal blooms, as we've already mentioned earlier, in lakes and ponds in our public parks. The lakes in Missouri are primarily man-made reservoirs that are used heavily for recreation. So conditions for toxic algal blooms will increase there as well. And I really think we also have to think about how this risk is distributed, because we know that communities that have already faced disinvestment and suffer from racial and economic disparity already bear the brunt of environmental hazards. And as we upgrade aging infrastructure, which we will need to do to adapt to more precipitation, more flooding, more heat stress, and this is everything from sewer systems, roads, bridges, all of these things are going to be impacted by changing temperatures, by heat. We have to prioritize equity and justice in all of this planning. And I would encourage EPA to always keep that at the forefront as we look to how these effects are going to impact our water resources. Thank you.
Great, Heather, thank you. Larry, and then Francis, then Kyle D, and then Dr. Sullivan.
Yeah, so
Larry, please.
Great, thank you. Also, as our climate is changing, we see an intensification of rainfall. And the latest climate assessment report has indicated that we'll see approximately a 10% increase in the 5% rainiest days by mid-century, and a 20% increase in the 5% rainiest days by end of century. And so we think about that in some practical terms. That means a 5-inch rain in 24 hours will become a 5.5-inch rain by 2050, and will become a 6-inch rain by the end of the century. Our soils in Iowa and across the agricultural Midwest can absorb about 2 inches of rain in the 24-hour period. So the 5-inch rain produces a 3-inch runoff, or by end of century, it will produce a 4-inch runoff. So that's an increase in runoff of 33%. That rainfall happens to be coming more often in the spring, drier times in the summer, and more often in the fall. And those wet springs and wet falls lead to an agronomic benefit of installing more and more tile drainage. At the same time as it's hard for farmers to plant their crop in the spring because of wet soils and hard for them to harvest their crop in the fall because of wet soils, it becomes even harder for them to empty these large confined animal feeding operation manure holding facilities. After the crop is harvested, the manure is applied to the land. In a very wet, leaky system, very little of that manure-based nitrogen remains available for the crop the following year. Likewise, in the spring, additional manure is applied to the land. We need to put a moratorium on the fall application of liquid-based animal manure and hydrous ammonia in the fall because it simply doesn't persist to serve the crop the following year. Thank you.
Larry, thank you. Francis, jump in.
Okay, thanks. And Larry's done a great job of laying out the magnitude of the problem we have in the Midwest, especially in Iowa, with water quality and how we're really going backwards. We're not really gaining much in cover crops, for example, but as I drive around Iowa, I see all these tile drains. I'd like to make a suggestion for how we can address this because we've not made any progress. With soil erosion, the 1985 Farm Bill required farmers to have a soil conservation plan. I would suggest that we have a water quality plan required on farms. And like a soil conservation plan, a farmer would have to have practices that would meet a T level, a tolerance level for nitrogen and for phosphorus. If the computer program didn't tell them they're going to meet that, and we have data on these practices. For example, we know that cover crops can reduce nitrate leaching by about 30%. So a farmer would have to meet a T value, a tolerance value for nitrogen and phosphorus, both. And if the computer says your practices are not going to make that goal, then they'd have to go back and change their practices until they can meet that T value for phosphorus and nitrogen. That's the only way we're going to ever make any progress. Right now, we have a voluntary water quality program in Iowa, and it's just magical thinking. It's not happening. The farm organizations are talking up all the practices that are happening. But as Larry said, we're going backwards faster than we're going forward. And so we need to have some regulation. And to me, a water quality plan that required meeting goals for phosphorus and nitrogen would do it. Thank you.
Great. Francis, thank you. Kyle, please.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I just wanted to throw into this conversation to the first question, is it important that EPA consider the impacts of climate change? The answer to that is, of course, yes. The point that I want to make, though, is that utilities, as the big regulated NPDES point sources since the beginning of the Clean Water Act, we plan for climate change. A well-run wastewater stormwater utility is planning 50, 60, 100-year infrastructure. And so we plan for climate change. And my point to this is that this needs to be done in partnership between EPA and the regulated entities. And there cannot be a sole focus on point sources. To Larry's point, to Francis's point, there needs to be a focus on non-point sources as well. The other point in terms of the impact in the Midwest, I just want to highlight that we're talking about wetter, warmer, wilder weather. That's the point. That's what it looks like. And that has to be communicated to customers so that they understand that their expectations around level of service for infrastructure needs to start to adjust. As Larry pointed out, the storms will change what you could expect for road flooding, basement flooding, that is going to start to change. And then lastly, I'll just highlight that with wetter, warmer, wilder weather, your infrastructure is stressed at a higher level. So we already have an issue with not fully funding infrastructure, and that is just going to be made more acute through climate change. So we need to continue infrastructure funding and recognizing that it costs money to maintain the water quality achievements that we've made.
Great. Kyle, thank you. I've got Dr. Sullivan, and then I have Kristen, and then so folks, please feel free to raise your hand. Like I mentioned at the outset, we have time for 15 or 20 comments here. So Dr. Sullivan, please.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I just repeat that I think there's been some great overviews of what we might expect in climate. So my comment is building on that and pointing out that the expected combination of climate change as well as continuing human activities, agriculture being a large one, but urbanization and others as well, we would anticipate there to be continuing hydrological shifts in our streams and wetlands, and particularly in those vulnerable waters. Now, here's where this becomes, I think, very critical, is one documented issue, one documented pattern that we've seen is the transition from, in streams, for example, from perennial, so those that flow year round, to intermittent, those that flow seasonally, to ephemeral. So streams changing their hydrological regime based on changes in altered precipitation and temperature regimes, as well as human activities such as groundwater withdrawal. So when you have that combination of activities, when we think of climate change moving into the future, we can expect that streams are going to shift in terms of their hydrological category. Now, the reason that's important is, of course, is because that idea of flow permanence, of water permanence, has been a critical piece in the discussions of what waters are protected and which waters are not protected. So I really encourage EPA and the Corps to consider the impact or the potential impact of climate change as a mechanism of streams and wetlands falling out of protection, so that we, if streams may be protected now under a regulation, a perennial stream, well, what happens if that falls to an intermittent or moves to an intermittent and then moves to an ephemeral? Does it then fall out of protection? Which I would expect to see more and more in the future. So I think that's a really important consideration to keep in mind. Thank you.
Great. And Dr. Sullivan, before you go off on mute, my colleague Janelle indicated that you have an article that you might want her to share with folks. You want to quickly talk about what folks might expect to receive from Janelle?
Yeah, I just thought it might be useful. It was an article that came out in Science, which was overviewing and this was when the Navigable Waters Protection Rule came out. But the relevance today is, of course, it overviews sort of the role in science and the critical nature of connectivity and how we can inform policy, but it also has some points in there of climate change. But it's succinct, has some maps. I think it might be helpful for folks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. So you all can expect to see an email coming from Janelle here in a few minutes that has that article attached to it. So I've got Kristen and then Kelly. Kristen, please.
Thank you. Just lower my hand. Okay, so I think I just want to echo what a lot of my colleagues here have said. Just as a public health professional, we see the impacts of climate change in a number of areas. We talked about strong storms. We know that means increased rainfall. It can be stronger rainfalls and bigger rainfalls. That means more flooded basements. That means more mold growth. So we're seeing kind of those unanticipated consequences of exacerbating respiratory conditions in, vulnerable individuals. And oftentimes that is, folks who are in rental housing. It can also be folks who are just not able to do those quick cleanups because they are often massive undertakings and efforts. To the non-point source contamination that one of my colleagues spoke about earlier, floods can mean septic systems struggle to dispose of and properly treat sewage on our individual systems, therefore allowing it to surface. That impact means that people are going to directly contact untreated wastewater, untreated sewage. If we do have combined sewer and storm systems, heavy rains can mean discharge to surface water in our communities, whether anticipated or unanticipated. And we know that raw sewage can contain a number of pathogens that impact human health. It's E. coli, it's hepatitis A, norovirus, just to name a few. More rainfall also means more places for mosquitoes to breed and to thrive, whether it's from small containers in yards to newly created or temporary wetlands. If you were anywhere near Southeast Michigan last summer, you were likely eaten alive by mosquitoes that hatched after those intense rainfalls we had in late June. We've seen the importation of the Aedes mosquito species, which is the vector that carries Zika virus. And we are likely just 1 or 2 small degrees away from that mosquito being able to overwinter into our community and becoming endemic. And the opposite is true too, right? Hotter weather may mean that we have more use for groundwater, large water withdrawals, small water withdrawals, and our individuals rely on drinking water from individual water wells. That less available groundwater means that those individuals no longer have a water source for their home. And we need to continually try to find new sources of water because they don't have access to municipal water services. Thank you.
Great, Kristen, thank you. I've got Kelly and then Irma. Kelly, please.
In addition to the issues that Heather mentioned in Missouri, it's really important to understand that the Missouri Department of Natural Resources has determined that water demands in certain areas of the state are not going to be able to be met long-term especially under the drought conditions associated with climate change. In Missouri, public water supplies are coming from both surface waters and groundwaters. And in the Ozarks, again, these two types of waters are interconnected. So if you are polluting one, you're most certainly polluting the other. This underscores the need to protect water quality in the streams and rivers that are hydrologically connected to these groundwater sources. And that's really out of reach if some of those surface waters are unprotected and not encompassed within the definition of waters of the United States. And we know that protecting these natural processes in wetlands and streams is essential to helping actually control the flooding and the pollution.
Great. Kelly, thank you. So I've only got one person left in the queue. I've got Irma. I'm going to come to you in just a second. But I want to encourage folks to please raise their hand and share your comments verbally. Things that I sort of anticipated hearing that I haven't heard yet is maybe speaking on additionally what Kristen said about public health effects or urban effects, or perhaps on the Great Lakes, just to give you all some ideas of, as I prepared, what I thought we might hear. Now, Irma, I know that you have to call in on the telephone, so if you want to hit *6 on your phone, I believe that's what unmutes your telephone, or if you're going to try to speak to the computer, you can do that as normal. We can't hear you. 1 second. Let's. Are you? If you're going to try to talk on your telephone, give me a thumbs up, and then. Okay. Nope. 1 second.
How is that?
Brilliant.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I can speak a bit to the Great Lakes impact, and it's certainly, these intense storms, are creating massive flooding issues here in the Great Lakes. And so with the flooding, we're also getting more CSOs, basement backups, and it's an expensive problem. We're saying, we hear sometimes that, well, it's expensive to make these improvements. It's going to cost a lot, but it costs a lot more, and financially and in public health, and just the personal trauma of flooding damage, and when you have water consistently in your home. So it's critical that we are thinking about this and thinking about prevention. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so, stronger regulations, looking at all water bodies and protecting them to kind of mitigate these impacts is significant. And then the, coastal erosion, the Great Lakes have, if you take it end to end, our coast is longer than the East and the West Coast. I mean, we have a tremendous amount of coastal property. And so, homes and damages, habitat, it adds up. And so we really do need to have, a strong standards and strong regulations. But I also would like to ask, I think there has to be greater interagency kind of work on this. So we have departments of transportation, our road folks, we really need to have, collaboration at the different levels of government and the different agencies within government, because there's an awful lot of stormwater that flows from our roadways and highways and such. And so we need to see more green infrastructure, more engineering with nature, all of that. And I would hope that EPA, Army Corps, and the DDOTs and the DOTs, would work hand in hand in trying to prevent these impacts from climate change.
Great, Irma, thank you. I mean, if you want to just press mute on your telephone, and then we won't mute it via the Zoom. So that way, all you have to do is unmute your phone next time you want to participate. Irma, thank you. I've got Marion, Chris, and Kyle. Marion, please.
Thank you. Certainly, as a pediatrician for almost 3 decades now, caring for children in these urban communities, under-resourced communities, everything about water quality in the U.S. is important, right? We learned a firsthand lesson from Flint, Michigan, when there were children across that community poisoned by the lead in their community, which affected them directly in their ability to learn and will affect them for decades to come, for a lifetime. So our water quality is not an option for us. It is not something that we can think about later. We have to think about it now. The children affected by the toxins found in their water system, those things won't change. We cannot undo them. We cannot think about them 30 years from now or have a 10-year plan. Those children are affected now. So we have to really work together, again, not only for our environment, but certainly for our environment, absolutely, but also for the children. Which brings us to questions of environmental justice. Our nonprofit is located in a very under-resourced area that is predominantly Black and Brown residents. And those Black and Brown residents really deserve safe drinking water and a safe future. One of the things that I do want to point out is that I do think that more interagency communication and collaboration needs to occur between environmental agencies and then health agencies. And I really just think that we undervalue that connection. And again, I would just have to point to the Flint, Michigan water crisis to underscore that. So thank you again.
Dr. Pearson, thank you. I've got Chris, then Kyle, then Willie. Chris, please.
All right, so I think the obvious answer to the question, the direct question, right, is does the EPA and the Army Corps need to look at climate change impacts is yes. I don't think anyone here would disagree. When I look at that from the business perspective, we have so many pressures on us right now within our industry. As an example, the grain crop from 2021 was reduced by about 30%. And the majority of people believe that is directly due to climate change. So we're already dealing with it within our supply chain in a major way that's like causing a lot of fear really in our industry for those who are following this. So I think water would definitely, as we see the impact of climate change on water quality, we need to get ahead of it to avoid future catastrophe to, all of us, human health and, within the business world. So we haven't, seen that directly yet, but I think that's right down the road. And I agree with everyone who's talking about the need to see more collaboration within our regulatory agencies. If you look at our elected officials, I think have a harder time agreeing on anything that advances things into recognizing the future that we're walking into. So the more we can get interagency collaboration and actually, create regulations to combat some of these things, the better for all of us. Thanks.
Chris, thank you very much. So we've got two people in the queue and we probably have time for 2 or 3 more comments after those 2 individuals. So please don't be shy to raise your hand. You can raise your hand again by pressing Alt-Y or pressing the emotions button and hitting raise hand. So I've got Kyle, then Willie. Kyle, please.
Thanks, Rob. I'm hoping that our Army Corps and EPA conveners are hearing in this conversation that what comes up again and again and again is land use decisions and how we use the land decisions and things that have historically not been seen as within the purview of the Clean Water Act because they are in some ways more quantity related than quality related. But we know now that quantity makes quality. And water quantity issues, flooding, erosion, sediment runoff, all these things lead to that water quality. So I think it's important to take this holistic view. And this conversation around climate change, essentially more water, more often just makes the system run harder and longer. And so it exacerbates these issues. So Ms. Leaphart's point about basement flooding, I want to make this clear why basements flood. Basements flood either because you get a storm that overwhelms the street drainage, or you have failing infrastructure. And this issue around maintenance is so important. You get a basement flooded because you have a surcharge system. Somehow stormwater is leaking into the sanitary system and it is coming up in people's basement. So if we want to solve these issues, we need to be real about what's happening. And the issue is that communities have been underfunded to maintain their local infrastructure. So I just encourage realness into what is causing the issue, and climate change just lays these issues bare. That's the deal. Thanks.
Thank you. I've got Willie, Heather, then Dr. Sullivan. Willie, please.
Awesome, thanks. So, Wilderness Inquiry, we do think it's very important for the EPA to consider climate change impacts on water quality and quantity in the Midwest. And to the question of, what are the impacts we're seeing? As I talked a little bit about before, a lot of the impacts we see are social. I'd mentioned we connect about 20,000 kids a year to recreational and educational opportunities on local waterways. And about 80% of the kids that join our programming, it's their first time in a boat and a first time on a waterway. And so for what we hear from youth is, climate change is really something that's on their minds. They see the impact, in their local communities and ask questions. And that really is right there in their backyards, not just splashed across the news. And so, as we're thinking about how to support the next generation, younger people coming up and learning, and as we're educating them, I think a fundamental piece of that is asking, where's your water going to come from? Is it going to be clean? Will you be able to drink it? Will you be able to kayak or fish or swim? And, they're looking to our leaders to deliver on that. That's the EPA and the federal government. And I thought Dr. Pearson's point about federal collaboration is important. We work really closely with land management agencies, with the Forest Service and Park Service and Bureau of Land Management on the educational pieces around water access and water quality. The other thing I'll say is, one of our key recreation areas where we take a lot of trips and participants from all over the country is to the boundary waters, and predictive studies have shown that the impacts of climate change, if they continue at the current trends, are going to shift that region from being the lake and lush forest that we know to more savanna. And so beyond just recreation, the boundary waters is a huge site for carbon sequestration. But beyond that, it's an important piece for defining the history and culture of Minnesota, and for investing in healthy outcomes for youth and families, and for recreating and economic activity. So we're hugely supportive of there being a strong push from the EPA to strengthen the rule, and especially around, all the waterways of, that flow into the big ones we know, like the boundary waters. Thanks.
Great, Willie, thank you. I've got Heather, then Dr. Sullivan, then we have time for one more a verbal comment, and then I'm going to invite folks to chat any final thoughts in on climate change. So I've got Heather, then Dr. Sullivan, then one more person, and then our chat exercise.
Great, thanks, Rob. I wanted to say, in addition to the threats to water quality that we've been talking about from climate change, I think it's also important to think about the long-term planning around how we build resilience and see our water resources as opportunities. We think about all of the impacts that are going to be on agriculture and transportation, and the way that we have approached our water resources up until now are going to be inadequate. We have to think about the modeling that we've been using, and also think about how the population is going to change, whether that's climate refugees coming from somewhere else around the country to the Midwest, or just how population is going to move, and how those resources need to be made available, and really what our floodplains can do for us in terms of flood absorption, water quality, building up those green infrastructure resources. So I think that's probably more for the Corps than it is for the EPA, but I think we also just need to think about what our water quality resources bring to us in terms of building resilient communities. Thank you.
Great, Heather, thank you. I've got Dr. Sullivan, and then Irma, you're going to have the last word on this. So Dr. Sullivan.
That's great, Heather. Thank you for bringing up resilience, because that's exactly what I was going to talk about. And so much of our conversation is about the outcomes of resilient watersheds, right? Resilient aquatic ecosystems. And so when we think about resilience from a scientific standpoint, and there are multiple definitions, but we think about it as the capacity of an ecosystem to respond to a disturbance or some sort of perturbation by resisting the damage and recovering in fairly quickly. And so I think one of the key points to communicate with the EPA and the Corps thinking about this is that as watersheds and aquatic ecosystems lose resilience, all the ecosystem services that we've been talking about, whether relate to public health or the economy, environmental justice, those all decline, right? And that's absolutely within the purview of the Clean Water Act, is to protect that resilience. And so when we talk about jurisdictional decisions over which waters are federally protected, There's a couple of points I would argue. One is that we need to think about them in context. So it can't just be stream A and wetland B, right? They need to think about where they are in the landscape. They need to think about the collective effects of groups of watershed, groups of, streams, groups of wetlands. I often talk about, use an example. If your hand, right, if you lose one finger is broken, you can still use it, right? But if all your fingers are broken, you lose the function of the hand, and that's very similar to watersheds. You start to take away one by one, and ultimately that resilience, that function is lost. So I think we really need to express our urgency to the EPA and the Corps, is that we need to protect and enhance, not just protect, but enhance resilience now, and it can't wait, because once a system has been impaired or destroyed, it can take a long time. Restoration can be effective to a degree, but it can take generations for something to really come back to the state that's providing the services that we need it to. So thank you.
Dr. Sullivan, thank you. Irma, please jump in.
Yeah, I think we've touched on it, but I just wanted to mention biodiversity. It's not something I know a lot about, other than we are destroying species. There are species that are disappearing because of our activity and because of what we're doing, and climate change is center of that. And I think sometimes we believe that as a superior kind of species, that we'll be okay, that it's just, a bug or it's just some other creature. But that interconnectedness, right? We are part of a system. We are connected deeply to these other species. And so I think we have to also remember that and think about that in all of our actions in water protection, land, soil, everything. So just, keeping that in mind, we're not here alone, and we are part of the ecosystem. And if one, to your hand, once one falls, so do the others. So just wanted to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for your participation in that discussion block. That went exactly like we had planned it, which does not happen very often. So we're going to recreate what we just did in the next discussion block, which is which I'll preview in just a minute here. But what I want to do is I want to provide 1 minute here, so 60 seconds for folks to go into the chat. And if there are any final thoughts you have on climate change and the WOTUS implementation, or any reflections on these questions, feel free to go ahead and drop that into the chat. So don't worry, I'm not going to sit here in an awkward 1 minute silence. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read some of the comments that folks have previously submitted for the benefit of the folks on the live stream. So 1 minute to please put your stuff in the chat, and for the folks on the live stream, I'm going to be reading some of the comments that came in. So comment from Heather was, and thinking about new best practices for infrastructure, including green infrastructure, we have to think about the carbon footprint of that new infrastructure and start implementing new practices and materials that will improve water quality, while also thinking about the carbon footprint of that infrastructure. Dr. Pearson's comment was, Francis, your comments about cover crops is very valuable. Organizations like Missouri Hives would hope that landowners, whether they be large agricultural entities or utility owners, would consider using native wildflower species that can act as pollinator patches for managed native or migratory pollinator populations. Kyle wrote, Dr. Pearson, thanks for your point. We, as the large utility, use native plants all over our service area and fund $2 million in green infrastructure grants each year with community partners, all with native trees and plants. Dr. Sullivan popped in the chat as part of a response to Irma's comment. Absolutely, and losses in biodiversity, as you say, provide the critical functions that enable water bodies to provide the ecosystem services on which we rely. And Chris put a comment in here that said, we need strong leadership and clear messaging that we have to see change quickly. Industry will suffer with reduced access to clean water, jeopardizing jobs and economic stability, in addition to the obvious public health impacts. So those were most of the comments that came in. And so if folks have any additional comments on climate change, feel free to finish typing your sentences and drop them in there. But what I'd like to do now is I would like to pivot the conversation, and I'm going to pop up here on the screen our next question. The discussion block for 35 minutes here is on environmental justice in downstream communities. And so the question is, From your perspective, how are some communities more affected than others when it comes to protecting water in the US? And is it important for EPA and Army to take this into consideration, and why? And so again, we are going to be asking folks to hit Alt-Y to raise their hand, or the emoticon buttons. If you can't figure out how to raise your hand and you want to jump into the conversation, shoot me a chat and I'll make sure to add you to the queue. And so I know that I've got Irma set up to go first. And then once Irma goes, Emmett, I'll come to you. Irma, please.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, from my perspective, communities are, we definitely, have some environmental justice impacts. There are definitely communities that are more affected than others, and we definitely want EPA to take this into consideration. So I have a couple of examples. So Detroit, and I mentioned some of this earlier, but Detroit and other large urban cities like Buffalo, Cleveland, Milwaukee are historically heavy industrialized cities. But that history has come at a cost. We're experiencing a high burden of legacy contamination with regard to air, soil, and water. And those who,
Okay.
So those who are experiencing the impact, from this contamination.
So Irma, we can hear you. Sorry I messed with you. I spotlighted your video because it's not showing up on the live stream because you're using your telephone. So that's why it looked weird on you, but we can hear you just loud and clear. So please continue. Oops.
So those who experience the worst public health outcomes and economic burden are typically African-American, Latinx, and low-income communities who live in close proximity to the polluted areas and who are engaging in sustenance fishing. So, we have two areas of concern here. One is the Detroit River, which is our drinking water source, and the other is the Rouge River, both with substantial beneficial use impairments, including contaminated sediment, CSOs, E. coli, you name it. And then last year in Southeast Michigan, we experienced what they're calling a 1,000-year storm that resulted in massive flooding. The wealthy communities that were impacted were able to rebound in like a week or two, right? Much faster. They experienced less burden because they're more resourced. However, Black and brown communities, we all know, due to years and decades of discriminatory hiring practices, wage discrimination, on top of government policies like redlining, has made them, sacrificed them and made them more vulnerable and less capable of responding or adapting to these disasters. Then we have nutrients from upstream agricultural land. It's causing toxic algal blooms in downstream communities, resulting in these communities having to pay more for water treatment. They need different and better chemicals. And then that cost is passed on to ratepayers, many of whom are low income. And so now they've got increased water bills that they may or may not be able to pay. And if they can't, they're then subject to shut off. These things simply are not fair. And environmental justice addresses, the fairness. People should be treated fairly, and they should have the ability to influence decisions that are impacting them and solutions that are being proposed. So in all these instances, we basically, we are not the cause, right? We're not the industrialist. We're not the capitalist. We're not causing these problems, but we are the ones who are facing the greatest burden. Financial burden and health, right? The mold in our homes, when there's flooding. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I know that are just really suffering badly behind, the flooding that occurred last year. So yes, it is important for EPA and Army Corps of Engineers to prioritize equity and fairness by protecting all water bodies and eliminating sources of pollution, including nutrient pollution, by helping to mitigate climate change by stopping the damage and destruction of wetlands, which are our massive carbon sinks. Supporting practices and implementing policies that facilitate proper and optimal flow and infiltration of stormwater, and continuing to engage the community to learn and to collaborate. Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity.
Great. Irma, thank you. I've got Emmett, then Kyle, then Dr. Sullivan. Emmett, please.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I think Irma just laid it out beautifully, some of my concerns, and wanted to keep it at the forefront with the EPA and especially the Army Corps of Engineers. And I think also Kelly in her opening remarks really kind of laid it out as well. Oftentimes underserved, under-resourced communities are not at the table. There is a digital divide, and especially in COVID or coming out of COVID, or we're in this kind of quandary right now. The digital divide really affects the ability for those individuals to participate in forums like this. And I think that needs to be considered. Here in Kansas City, you've heard myself and Dr. Pearson talk about Brush Creek. It is a vast difference between what Brush Creek looks like in the high income area or our highest shopping district, as opposed to what it looks like outside of my window. And I've talked to the Army Corps of Engineers, and they've, explained, well, one wasn't meant to be a beautification. I hear that, but it is. And so, oftentimes those conversations get lost because I think, as Irma alluded to, as well as Kelly, those without resources or those readily means oftentimes don't have the same voice as those who do. So absolutely, I would want EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers to take that in consideration. Thanks.
Great, Emmett, thank you. I've got Kyle and then Dr. Sullivan. Kyle, please.
Yes, thanks. Just a couple points to the, some communities are more affected than others. Just 2 points on this. Our experience in Cleveland, Northeast Ohio, is that disadvantaged communities are more affected because being in poverty, a larger percentage of your income goes to paying for utilities, all utilities, water, sewer, gas, electric, cable, etc. So there's a percentage issue. And then being in older communities, those disadvantaged communities, older urban communities, these issues of failing local infrastructure become more acute. So basement flooding, street flooding, sanitary sewer overflows, etc. So the point is that everyone deserves access to clean, fresh, reliable water and sewer service. And there's 2 ways that are essential to getting there. You have to have well-run and efficient utilities, and those utilities have to have affordability programs to make sure that folks have the help they need to be able to afford the service. Because delaying investment in infrastructure to artificially keep rates low is not justice. So I'll just throw those points out there.
Great. Kyle, thank you. So I've got Dr. Sullivan, but I don't have anyone else in the queue. So I really want to encourage folks to use this time to share your perspective on environmental justice in downstream communities. We have about 25 minutes left here, so we could have 10 or 12 additional comments. So please don't hesitate to press Alt-Y to raise your hand, or you can chat me if you can't figure out how to raise your hand. Dr. Sullivan?
Yeah, thanks. So I also would say, I think Irma and Emmett's, I would just build on what they were saying. Thanks for sharing those perspectives, and earlier ones by Dr. Pearson and Heather. I think a few points. One is that, yes, absolutely, more affluent communities are buffered from the effects of losses in water quality, right? And so, but often those are the communities that have the voice and are gauging the impacts of losses in water protection, and that needs to stop. Those cannot be the communities that we're using to gauge the effects of losses in water protection. I think Irma's point is another really important one about the legacy effects. This is something I alluded to before, in terms of acting now versus trying to restore later. Legacy effects are a good example. It can take generations, and it can be incredibly harmful to wait. So it's not acceptable to remove protections to try to fix things later. There's no reason to do that. 2 additional points I would add to the conversation on environmental justice is that we also have to think about our territories. As far as I know, the WOTUS applies to our territories as well. So for example, Puerto Rico, which is of course all, Latine, the EPA and the Corps need to consider the ramifications in our territories, which I think is very important. Oftentimes the cultural context and the geographic scope, they're going to be quite different than the mainland. Second point, and I've mentioned indigenous, I think issues a couple times here, and the importance of taking this into consideration. Certainly for reservations, and we need to understand the U.S. has a trust responsibility that they entered into when indigenous folks were displaced and reservations were ceded in giving out millions of acres. That trust responsibility guarantees a stewardship of natural resources, water, land, air. And so in that vein, I just want to make a comment that Native Americans, American Indians on reservation, of course, they're not just other stakeholders, right? But they're sovereign nations, and that voice needs to be elevated in these conversations to respect indigenous knowledge on tribal lands. So I think those are a few other points I just want to add to that environmental justice piece of the conversation.
Dr. Sullivan, thank you. I've got Kelly, then Heather. Kelly, please jump in.
So I think that in this context that we're speaking about with the waters of the U.S. definition, the number one thing that the agency can do to protect environmental justice communities and downstream communities is fully restore the historically broad definition of waters of the United States. Because in the absence of that, in the absence of states stepping in to fill the gap, which they've demonstrated they're not generally willing to do or able to do, we have untreated toxic, biological, chemical, and other waste that can be discharged directly into these waters without meeting any of the standards. So the agencies really, I think, in addition to restoring those broad protections, need to really focus on implementing their oversight responsibilities with the states. It's kind of clear from regular reviews where states are coming up short, and the EPA needs to really exercise their oversight responsibility, provide resources to the states, and hold states accountable for fully implementing the law. But in addition to that, I wanted to make this point. In Missouri, we have waters flowing out of the state into Arkansas and Kansas and Oklahoma, and we have waters coming into the state from Kansas and a bunch of other states upstream in the Missouri River watershed. And so in order for downstream and out-of-state communities to be protected, we have to have a consistent federal definition of waters of the United States and consistently implemented clean water standards that are at least as stringent as the federal floor. This is really one of the most fundamental features of the Clean Water Act. It's designed to protect downstream water communities, but also provide them with a remedy if the government isn't doing the right thing and isn't fully implementing the law. And I have this example in my own watershed where I live, where we have the Spring River flowing through my hometown, being polluted with nutrients and pathogens, flowing into Kansas and then into Oklahoma, and joining with the Neosho River to form the Grand River. The Neosho and the Spring Rivers are important water resources to the 9 tribes of the Intertribal Council of Northeastern Oklahoma and other subsistence and sport users in the area. And Grand Lake is an important water resource for the Cherokee Nation, and the lake is located within their jurisdictional boundaries. In Ottawa County, where these tribal interests are right over the border into Oklahoma, we have these communities that are already severely burdened by this lead contamination and abandoned mining lands and acid mine discharge. And we also have, Grand Lake being heavily polluted by dissolved oxygen and toxic algal blooms and this sort of thing, even resulting in the closure of the lake. So removing clean water protections from all of these tributaries and wetlands and small impoundments, et cetera, within these watersheds, which could happen under a definition that requires certain types of connections will exacerbate this pollution and the pollutant load that's being borne by these tribes and these communities downstream. That was long. Thank you.
No worries, Kelly. That was fabulous. Thank you. Heather, I saw that you had your hand up and then you put your hand down. Heather, I don't know if you wanted to take yourself out of the queue, but I wanted to make sure that I did not skip you over. Heather, did you have a thought at this point?
Sorry, yeah, I just ended up putting it in the chat. I just echo a lot of what Kelly said about being a downstream community and the burden of having to clean up what is coming our way. And I think there's also a lot too in terms of flooding, and I can add that to the chat as well, so other folks can chime in here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Heather. Larry, jump in. And then after Larry, I don't have anyone queued up, so please don't hesitate to raise your hand to jump into the conversation. Larry?
Yeah, perhaps, just a bit more of the same, but, in Iowa, oftentimes a lot of the attention that's been brought to this topic has been generated by the lawsuit from the Des Moines Waterworks in the city of Des Moines to 3 counties in rural Iowa for violation of the Clean Water Act as non-point source pollutants. But the city of Des Moines and the Des Moines Waterworks serves about 600,000 in their service area, and can afford to operate in some ways the nation's largest nitrate removal system because they've got ratepayers that support their utility. It's much more difficult for some of the smaller communities in rural Iowa. Ottumwa is a small, impoverished community that supports much of agriculture through their industries. And many of the people that live in that community are at or below the poverty line and really struggling to make ends meet down there. And so for the city of Ottumwa to pass on the burden of the cost of a nitrate removal system for their surface water drinking utility comes at a very unfair request to that community. And so I just want to not lose track of these small rural communities in Iowa that in many ways are just hanging on, often in support of agriculture, and yet having to solve these agricultural borne water pollution issues.
Great. Larry, thank you. I've got Irma, Kyle, then Kristen. Irma, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how appropriate this is, but I'm concerned about pipelines. So we've got one here under the Straits of Mackinac, the Enbridge, real thick, heavy oil pipeline. And right now we're at a little bit of an impasse with the Canadians on this. We want to shut it down because if it busts, right, we've got a big problem. So it is a navigable, Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, they're navigable waters. But if this pipeline goes, if it breaks, we've got a huge problem. Is there something that if there's some way you can influence that or help us to address this problem, that would be great. Because it's another one of those situations. Actually, it'll affect everybody, but of course, again, low income communities, we're going to ultimately have to pay more, pay the same, and be overburdened by this. But everyone's going to be impacted. This is going to be massive if it were to happen. And with this pipeline, it's almost 100. Well, I guess it's close to 70 years old. With a life expectancy, it was only supposed to last about 60. And we've seen what happens. Kalamazoo, Michigan, and maybe other places have experienced pipelines bursting. And that was over 10 years ago, I think, and they're still working on it. So these are massive issues in addition to everything else. So if there's something you can do about that, it would be great.
Great, Irma, thank you. I've got Kyle, Kristen, Dr. Sullivan, and Chris, please.
Thanks, Rob. So I think it's important when we're having this conversation about EPA and the Army Corps taking things into consideration, let's talk about how they take things into consideration in terms of actually how this engagement is done with communities with disadvantaged communities, with folks living in environmental justice areas. You know, we're the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. We have 1 million customers. The city of Cleveland is the second poorest big city in the nation. So we have disadvantaged communities in our service area, and we're very focused on making sure that communication is timely, truthful, and two-way. And we learn from our partners like Environmental Health Watch and Black environmental leaders here in Northeast Ohio. So when EPA and Army Corps go to talk to folks about the issues that are important for them, it's important to actually offer a solution to those issues and to value people's time. And I think too often we go into communities, we ask people to come to a community meeting at an awkward time to sit and listen to us talk, and we don't actually solve the issues that people are worried about. So I think that needs to be the way that communication and engagement is done. It has to be two-way communication that actually solves people's issues.
Great. Kyle, thank you. I've got Kristen, then Dr. Sullivan, then Chris. Kristen,
Thank you.
please.
Just to echo what everyone said, I mean, they've said it probably way more eloquently than I'm going to, but just, you know, again, from that public health perspective, we know that viruses and bacteria don't discriminate on the basis of race, gender, ethnicity, national origin, income, but there are disparities, and we are seeing those, and they are deeply rooted in our society, and we're seeing health outcomes because of those disparities. You know, several people have mentioned the Flint water crisis. I'll mention it again just because it is such a strong case for environmental justice and the need for environmental justice in the United States. We talked about fish advisories, just to nail the point home. We have people every day making decisions on whether or not their family eats today from their sustenance fishing, or to avoid a risk for a health condition in the future. You know, if your family is going to go hungry, I know what you're going to choose every time. And so again, just thinking about trying to make that prevention so that we don't have fish advisories, that we don't have these downstream impacts. We've talked about harmful algal blooms, and we know that they're, again, disproportionate impact on communities of color, low-income communities. In addition to those direct health impacts of respiratory illness, we've also got folks who may not have be able to use the water bodies in their neighborhood for recreation. Not only is water recreation enjoyable, it's an important form of exercise. There's health benefits to all of those aspects too that, you know, again, people in these communities are not being able to realize. And then we've talked about the climate and resilience of climate and the environment, but people also need to be resilient. And again, we're not seeing the same resiliency among all of our communities because of our historical inequities. So thank you, everyone.
Kristen, thank you. Dr. Sullivan, then Chris.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to go back to something Kelly said, which I think is really very important and probably useful for all of us to think about more. But is that right? The Clean Water Act, the floor that is set in terms of water quality standards and what waters are protected across the country is so critical, particularly when we're talking about underserved communities and protecting that, because although some states can take primacy over the federal standards, right, that the Clean Water Act sets to be equally or more restrictive, many actually cannot. So 28 states have passed laws that limit their water quality standards to the floor established by the EPA. So whatever the EPA sets, they cannot go above that. Others choose not to. And I think this was mentioned before. Ohio, for example, has in the last couple of years, since the Navigable Waters Protection Rule moved to align state waters of the state with a lot of pushback, but with the more restrictive definition that was set up by the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The point I'm trying to make here is that it needs to be, in order to protect not only our most vulnerable ecosystems, but our most vulnerable communities, it needs to be, we need to express the urgency to the EPA and the Corps that the floor that's set by the EPA needs to be high, because everybody doesn't have the funds or the legal capacity to actually exceed that. So it can't be the argument of, well, we're going to set this and other states can, states or tribes can do what they want beyond that, because that's actually not how it plays out on the ground.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. Chris, you're up.
There we go. So I agree with everything that's being stated, and there is definitely an unfair impact on communities of color specifically, or under-resourced communities when we're not protecting these waters. And that from the business lens, right, that shows up in a number of ways. Those are our employees who are now experiencing health impacts and have more absent days and missed work days, and have to care for their family members who are ill because of the uncleanliness of their water. It is also, those are our consumers too, right? As all consumers' products. I mean, they probably may not be drinking my beer, but they're drinking someone else's beverage that is directly impacted by not understanding the connectedness of all of these waterways and how the health of water in one space truly does impact the health of all the water. I think, you can see these direct impacts like Flint and the oil spill by Kalamazoo. I mean, those are very direct, but it all leaches out, right? The connectedness, I think, is such an important issue, and people need to look beyond their bubble and recognize that it will impact all of us in some way, whether it's through employees, supply chain, consumers, however we want to look at it. But, I strongly believe in these regulations are important, and we need to just keep driving forward with making change happen so we can protect people now and in the future.
Chris, thank you. So we've got Irma in the queue, but we probably have time for 3 or 4 other comments before our time together wraps up. So if you've got any additional thoughts, now's the time to raise your hand so you can jump into the conversation. Irma, please. We can't hear you. Gotta catch that phone.
Okay, how about now?
Yes, brilliant. Thank you.
So I wanted to mention another example here in Detroit that we experienced. So because of phosphorus loading, because of the Lake Erie toxic algal blooms, the city of Detroit had to, through their NCDES permit, and they installed about $2 billion with a B dollars worth of infrastructure to try to, I think we were under consent decree, to deal with the phosphorus flowing into Lake Erie. And the city did that at, this great expense, which resulted in this quadrupling of water rates and water bills. We have a city primarily African-American, about a third is living in poverty. So what has happened because of that, and as an environmentalist, right, I'm like, yay, we don't want to be contributing phosphorus to Lake Erie. We want to protect Lake Erie water quality. But yet, on the flip of that, we now have these huge water bills, water rates, higher than anyone in Michigan, probably, maybe not Flint. But, and then as a consequence of that, major water shutoffs, which is, which has been horrible. And so it's like, that's okay, right? We did our part to this huge negative consequence and heavy burden. But now we know that it's agriculture, right, that's really contributing a vast amount of the phosphorus to the western basin of Lake Erie. And so it, again, isn't fair. One group has to pay, one group has to deal with the problem, and another group is not. And so this is just back to the fact that, I'm really, agriculture's got to do their part. And, others are willing to do it or being forced to do it. So they also need to have to address that. So I just wanted to, just again, one more example of the unfairness of how things have been occurring.
Great, thank you. Dr. Pearson.
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to touch on the point that we talk a lot about which communities are bearing the effects of the climate change and of poor water quality standards. But I would like to just point out that at Mohives, we've created, our 2-year-old nonprofit has created a tiny green jobs training program, right? I think that we really need to talk about the fact that we need to see more Black, Brown, and Native communities represented in the employment at the agency levels, like at the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, because when we talk about wanting to get into community and involved relationship and get feedback from, if no one looks like them at those agencies, it's really hard to develop those relationships. And so we, again, would like to see more employment opportunities, and not just at the basic levels, but at the leadership levels at the EPA, and then getting those people that look like communities in which you need to be involved in, getting those people directly involved in the conversations. And so again, employment at all these federal levels is critically important to continue the conversations and continue the progress. Thank you.
Great. Dr. Pearson, thank you. So we've got about 2 or 3 more minutes. And so I want to see if folks have any final thoughts here on environmental justice downstream communities. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand or just jump right into the conversation.
Rob, I don't know if you can see me. I've been raising my hand, but
jump in, please, Francis.
Okay. I wanted to take off on something Irma said, which is very important. Agriculture contributes a whole lot of the pollution, most of it we can say probably, but we're pretty much exempt. And we don't have the political will to do anything about it. Agriculture thinks they're exempt from regulation. And a little historical perspective, I worked at U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington in the late 80s and early 90s. 1988, we launched the National Water Quality Initiative, with 5 agencies in USDA. EPA was involved, the Army Corps of Engineers, a lot of agencies. And the key thing was it was going to be voluntary for agriculture. We thought in 5 years, we can fix a problem voluntarily. That was 1988. And there's a 5-year water quality program. And since then, I call it the water quality merry-go-round. Every 5 years, we get some new politician who says we're going to have a water quality initiative. And it lasts as long as the politician, and it never goes anywhere. So this is great to be part of this. And I appreciate all the work you're all doing. But unless we can have the political will to regulate agriculture, we're not going to get very far. Thank you.
Great. Francis, thank you so much. Okay, 1 or 2 more comments here, and then I am going to move back to that chat exercise. We did it more. I'm inviting folks to put any final thoughts into the chat, but I'd like to make space for 1 or 2 other folks to share any thoughts they have on this. And while folks are deciding whether to jump in or not, I just recognize how long this meeting has been and how hard it is to be present and active and brilliant like you all have been for the last 2.5 hours. So I understand that fatigue could be setting in. Okay, so why don't we move to the chat exercise? And so again, what I'm asking folks to do is to put into the chat any final thoughts they have on the question that's up there on the screen, or any final thoughts they want to share with EPA with regard to WOTUS implementation. Following that 1 minute, I'm going to come to Sylvia, to you to close this out. So 1 minute, and then for the benefit of the folks on the live stream, I'm going to be reading out some of the conversations that some of the chats that have come in. So one chat that came in is Heather said, green infrastructure projects can either enhance a community or isolate them. It can either provide new benefits or burdens. So thinking about how these are designed is another place to ensure equity across communities. We've seen this come up in the implementation of the consent decree with our sewer districts in St. Louis. Kyle mentioned that we also need to ensure long-term maintenance of green infrastructure practices so they are not a burden on communities where built, but can continue to provide amenities. Kristen indicated that the issue of floor standards is very important, and EPA needs to be the leader for stronger protections. Emma agreed with that and indicated that ballast water laws are as well need strong federal protections. Kristen put into the chat that underground gas and oil pipelines are another example of aging infrastructure that represents a significant threat to our community. Several folks agreed with Dr. Pearson's comments about ensuring a diverse workforce at regulatory agencies and utilities. There are at least 3+1s on that. And then Dr. Sullivan indicated that he thought that groups like this roundtable could help advise EPA and the Corps in terms of how to integrate the best available evidence into the rulemaking process. Ultimately, there will be many opposing views to those we have collectively expressed today, but it's critical that important evidence is not simply recorded and sidelined, as largely was the case with science and the Navigable Water Protection Rule, i.e. the previous WOTUS rule. Stacy Jensen from the Army Corps put that there are 12 oil and natural gas pipeline activities that are reviewed, that are in review and underway for the Army. Okay, so that's it. I want to, before I turn it over to Sylvia, I want to read one more chat that came in, just because I was trying to read all of them. A couple more chats here. Thank you all. I realize that 1 minute is not long to type in some final thoughts here. So we need a sense of urgency around WOTUS and non-point source pollution, missing the 2015 goals of the Hypoxia Task Force, and then moving their target out to 2035 with viable plans, actions, nor policy or regulatory changes is not acceptable. Chris indicated that she hopes to see actions resulting from all these roundtables and appreciates being part of this roundtable. Emma has put into the chat that this has been a wonderful conversation, but points out that this is an all hands on deck moment in our history, that climate change and pollution definitely impact communities of color and low income communities, but we're all connected to the environment and we all need clean water to drink, healthy soil so we can restore and protect our waterways. Okay, great. So Sylvia, I'd like to turn it over to you to wrap us up.
All right, and I'm going to share that duty and that privilege, actually, Rob, with Stacy Jensen at Army Civil Works as well. She and her whole team, of course, including Jamie and all the other folks that are on the line with us, and are great partners at EPA, and we really appreciate working with them, and frankly, it's a pleasure. Hi, everyone. My name is Sylvia Quast. I'm a senior advisor to Radhika Fox, who's the assistant administrator for the Office of Water at EPA. Frankly, I've been working on the issues of waters of the United States for about 27 years now in various capacities in the federal government. I was at the Department of Justice doing environmental enforcement work and also defending the government when it got sued under the Clean Water Act, and done a lot of things with this. And I just can tell you that on behalf of EPA, I really appreciate all of you taking the time and the effort and putting so much thought into this. I mean, you guys are our first roundtable, and it's been incredibly valuable and interesting. Frankly, I don't know, maybe other folks have, so much stuff going on that they haven't been able to focus, Rob, but I've really loved this. I mean, this has been really great to hear from folks. I had a sense at the beginning, we've done a few regional events where we've gone out, for example, to North Dakota, to Alaska, to hear what people have to say about waters of the United States. And we learned a lot from those experiences. So I already had a good feeling about these regional roundtables, and this roundtable has definitely been proof that it was a great idea to do this. It's been great listening to you rather than talking at you. Sometimes at the government, I feel like we talk at people a lot and we're always not as good as we could be at listening. And frankly, it pays off for us to listen because we learn so much. There's so many facts. I could just go on and on about all the facts that you guys have been laying out there today that have been so interesting and important really for us in thinking about how to carry out the responsibilities that we have under the Clean Water Act. One of the things that's become really clear, I mean, I knew before, but kind of listening to you, it's become like viscerally clear, is the interconnectedness of water to all kinds of issues. And also across the country, when we're hearing from you in the Midwest, the things that you're talking about aren't things that are just things happening in the Midwest, but in the Southeast, in the Northeast, in the West, everywhere. So it's been really, really interesting. I mean, your thoughts, your examples, your stories, your perspectives, the interconnectedness of it is amazing. You've given us a lot to think about how we could do a better job of implementing definitions of waters of the United States, and frankly, more when it comes to the Clean Water Act. I know that I've got colleagues in our Midwestern regions of EPA who are watching this right now. They're on the live stream, and I'm sure they're taking away a lot of things. They've mentioned some of the concerns that you've raised, but I think there's a lot more that they're going to get out of all the points that you all have raised today.
I want to thank also you, Rob, and Janelle for the great work that you did in facilitating, organizing this roundtable. It's really been a pleasure working with you, and I'm sure it will continue to be a pleasure. And again, I want to thank the roundtable participants in particular for taking the time and the effort to put this together, and your participation. It is really, really appreciated. Stacy, let me just turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Sylvia. So I'm Stacy Jensen. I'm the Assistant for Regulatory and Tribal Affairs in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. I just want to thank you on behalf of Army and the Corps for your participation in this important roundtable. These two topics of climate change and environmental justice are of extreme importance to Army Civil Works and my leadership as a whole right now. We've been focusing on climate resiliency for core civil works infrastructure for decades, but my leadership is committed to ensuring we continue to integrate the best science as we move into the future. In addition, my leadership is embarking on an effort to modernize civil works to ensure environmental justice is woven throughout the whole program. Mr. Connor, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, recently signed an interim environmental justice implementation memo for civil works to ensure engagement with the underserved and disadvantaged communities is built upon from our current methods, to consider how best to engage these communities, to listen, and to identify how we can use our mission to meet their vision, even if it's a whole of government approach beyond just our civil works program, available programs and services. And importantly, that our commitment to fulfilling our tribal trust responsibility must be integrated into all that we do. These two topic areas that we discussed today on climate change and environmental justice demonstrate how these topic areas are so important, not just our civil works, technical planning, construction services, but also ways that they must be considered in implementation of regulatory context, including the definition of waters in the United States. And we've heard some really valuable input here today that we will consider as we move into implementation for the definition of WOTUS. And I want to thank you all again for your participation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Stacy. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time.